What?
Have you ever heard of the Black Death?
Nope.
It's a really deadly disease. It's caused by infectious bacteria.
Boring.
Seriously, it killed around half of Europe in the 14th century.
That was a long time ago. Still boring.
Well, that was a long time ago, but in 2013, an outbreak of the plague hit Madagascar.
2013? Really? Well, Madagascar is on the other side of the globe. Still don't care. Let me watch my show.
2013? Really? Fine. Madagascar is far away, but did you know that last year Yosemite National Park temporarily closed 2 of its campgrounds because of the plague?
Yosemite? Which Yosemite? You mean Yosemite National Park in California?
Yeah, the one and only.
Wow, that's cool and scary and cool. Scary cool. Tell me more.
Hi, I'm Chloe Pendergrass. I love bloody, gory stories, and do I have one for you. Today I'm going to tell you about the Black Death of the Middle Ages, otherwise known as the Great Mortality of the 14th Century or the Plague.
The first impulse is to run. And when there's no place left to run, pray. Pray like there's no tomorrow. Because for the people dying all around you, tomorrow will never come. No one knows where to hide, how to save themselves, how to survive. Bodies beyond number. A firestorm of violence and madness. The terrible vengeance of God. It is the Black Death of the Middle Ages. The greatest biological disaster in the history of mankind. It is, as one witness testifies, the end of the world.
The greatest biological disaster in the history of mankind. Historians estimate it caused 400 to 800 deaths per day. The Black Death efficiently and mercilessly wiped out half of Europe. That is why, by the time it ran its course, the Black Death had changed European society forever. Neither class of birth nor wealth mattered in the face of such a powerful force. People lost their minds watching everyone die around them. Then they too would become infected. The Black Death brought out the best and the worst in everybody. Rulers, men of the church, families, friends, and neighbors had choices to make. Some tried to help, others ran to save themselves. Either way, many succumbed to the illness. Doctors of the time who dressed in funny masks which they thought would protect them were helpless against it with their cures of inhaling fresh herbs, leeches, bloodletting, and worse, opening up infected buboes which sometimes helped the patient but always spread the disease to others. The greatest biological disaster in the history of mankind. But it wasn't the only one. There were 2 other plague pandemics in history. They were very important turning points. One was in the 6th century in ancient Rome called the Justinian plague, and the other was in the 19th century in China. Like I was telling my brother earlier, there have been smaller outbreaks of plague in our day and age. So why was the outbreak in the 14th century so devastating? The reason is the environment of a medieval town. To learn more about that, go visit my exhibit. Now let's talk to an expert. To help me make sense of it all, I met with Dr. Richard Quintiliani. He's a pretty cool guy. As an infectious disease doctor at Hartford Hospital, he cures sick patients and works in this super cool lab. He was also the doctor who reported the first case of a bioterrorism attack using anthrax in Washington, D.C.
Bioterrorism? Who said anything about bioterrorism? Yep, it's all connected. Just wait till you hear what Dr. Q had to tell me.
Now let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about all that, I have to teach you about the bacterium itself. The Black Death is an infection caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. An infection is when one of your cells becomes invaded by a bacterium which takes over that cell. A bacterium is a unicellular microorganism. That means the entire creature is made of one cell and it is super, super small. It is so small that if you sharpen a pencil almost to breaking point and make the tiniest dot, it is still smaller than that. Most bacteria, that's just the plural of bacterium, are not harmful to other living organisms. The bacterium Yersinia pestis is a bacillus, which means it is rod-shaped. It has filaments on the outside which look just like little hairs. It is covered by a slime envelope which is heat labile, which means that it can be changed easily. The life cycle of Yersinia pestis is very interesting. It lives in infected rats and fleas but doesn't always make them sick. First, a flea bites an infected rat and drinks its blood. Then, a toxin that is released by the bacterium clogs the flea's digestive system. That means that the flea becomes very hungry, so hungry in fact that it will bite any victim in sight. Fleas prefer to feed on rats, but a human will work in a pinch. The flea bites an unlucky human, and to clear out the blockage, it regurgitates or throws up into the wound. Now, the bacterium is inside of the human. That is how the plague travels from rats into humans. Once it gets into the human, well, you'll hear about that from Dr. Q a little later. When a person gets sick with the plague, they will have one of these three types of the illness: the bubonic, the pneumonic, or the septicemic. They are sometimes described as separate, but Dr. Quintiliani will explain how they are interconnected depending on the entry point of the bacteria, how it spreads in the body, and how well the body defends itself. Most commonly, the flea bites the person in the feet or ankles. Then the body tries to defend itself against the bacteria by bringing them into the lymphatic system to get cleared out. That is why the most common form of the plague involves infection in the lymphatic system. This is called the bubonic form of the plague, and it is very painful. Like I said, it is the most common type. The patient develops fever, black spots, and big swellings called buboes in the armpits, neck, and groin, mainly, or anywhere where there are lymph nodes which the bacteria invade and cause them to swell. Sometimes patients also become confused. In the 14th century, the mortality rate for this was somewhere between 60 and 90%. It was also a long process of up to 5 days of sickness before recovery or death. Here is Dr. Q to tell us about it.
Are a little bit interconnected.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know what when you told me originally you're the bubonic form that goes in your lymph nodes? Can you feel these here?
Yeah.
You know these little bumps? Those are your lymph nodes.
Oh.
Yeah. Those are there. Do you ever get a sore throat? Do you ever get a strep throat or a sore throat? Next time you get one, feel right here. When you have a sore throat, you probably feel those little bumps, those little balls, are a little bigger than usual, and maybe they even hurt a little bit. Those are your lymph nodes. So they're like filters. They're like filters. So when you get and you have them all through your body, in different parts of your body. So there's a disease called cat scratch fever, cat scratch. So kids would get scratched here with a cat scratch. The infection gets in here, it travels up your lymphatics, up to the nearest lymph node, which is usually in the elbow. So that can get called your epitrochlear lymph node. And then it travels up into the lymph nodes under here. If you ever feel under here, that's called your axilla. You got more lymph nodes under there. So if you ever get like an infection on your fingertip, or you get a cat scratch disease, it's called, and oftentimes the lymph nodes above it can get swollen. And that's exactly what happens with the plague. The plague, you get a flea bite. And oftentimes, and I don't know why this is the case, but it's more on the below, down on the lower extremities. But you get a flea bite down there, and it travels. And up here in our groin, we have lymph nodes. So if you ever feel in your groin, you can also feel bumps. And so that's the main place where the bubonic plague develops, the big lymph nodes right there. So the infection gets flea bite down here, it travels up your lymphatics, the closest lymph nodes are right here in the groin, your lymph node gets huge, and that's why it's called bubonic plague. Bubo, you know better than I do.
Yeah.
Bubo, right, that's called a bubo. And then though, what happens next though? That's bubonic plague though. The reason I started this, talking about this, that the different diseases or different forms are sometimes connected, because after that, where does the bacteria go after that lymph node? It goes into your bloodstream. You have all the answers. Exactly. And then, but if it goes in your bloodstream, that's kind of the septicemic form, right?
Yeah.
So exactly, it turns into the septicemic form. When you read about the septicemic form, usually they're not talking about that kind of septicemic form. They're just talking about the kind when you don't see a bubo.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, but they are, before I already talked to you about it, once it gets in the blood, now it can go to the lung. And now it's the pneumonic form. So they're all can be connected. So.
The second form of the illness is the septicemic form. The patient develops fevers, rashes, blisters, and gangrene, which is shown in this picture. The mortality rate for the septicemic form in the 14th century was 100%, which means it killed everybody who contracted it. It was the quickest cause to death. There are stories of people walking around feeling normal in the morning who would be dead by sundown.
Particular bacteria tends to cause what we call sepsis. It produces substances that are released from the cell, which cause your body to go haywire, basically. Your blood pressure drops, you can't breathe, you have high fevers, and basically when your blood pressure drops, you're not getting blood to your heart, you're not getting blood to the organs, your liver, all of the stuff that keeps you alive, and that's, for the most part, how it kills you. Other types of infections can do lots of very specific things. That they infect certain cells. There's certain kinds of bacteria, for example, that.
Which brings us to the last form of the illness, the pneumonic plague. The patient develops a fever, severe cough, and they may even cough up blood. He or she will have a very hard time breathing, and as the oxygen levels to the body drop, there is extreme muscle weakness, organs can shut down, and the blood pressure drops rapidly. In medieval times, it had a mortality rate of 100%, which means everyone who got sick with it died. Mercifully, the patient with this form of the illness in the 14th century would die within 1 to 2 days, so it was a relatively quick death. This form of the illness is the most deadly. As Dr. Quintiliani said, sometimes it happens because of the spread from the lymphatic system or the blood in the patient, but it can also happen much more quickly by a patient breathing in air with droplets of fluids that have the bacteria that were coughed up by an infected person.
In some cases, the bacteria can go to your lungs and cause a kind of pneumonic plague. There's two kinds of pneumonic plague. That's one kind of lung plague, pneumonic plague, where the bacteria goes from your blood, like the septicemic one you told me about earlier. The septicemic form, sometimes the bacteria goes from the blood to the lung, and now it's a pneumonic plague. But that's not the main one. The other one is when you inhale it that way. That's also a pneumonic plague. And when you have a pneumonic plague like that, it can be very, very deadly.
So not many people had any chance of surviving these awful sicknesses, but for the people who did survive, how did their immune system fight it off? Here is Dr. Q to help me explain. So how does your immune system fight off the plague?
When you get an infection, your body produces cells in your body. It's from your immune system to fight a foreign, something that it doesn't recognize. So your body knows you, but if something goes inside of you that's not you, your body figures it out. And that's the thing that figures it out, the system in your body that figures it out is your immune system. And it can work in many different ways, but one very common way is it makes something called antibodies, again, proteins that go right to the Yersinia bacteria to stick on it and to basically destroy it. And that's how it can kill the bacteria. But oftentimes that's not enough, and the person can die, though. So.
Fascinating, right? I mean, now that you know everything about the plague in the 14th century, with the mortality rates and everything, what about the plague today? And what about the plague and other pandemics tomorrow? Nowadays, in the 21st century, we feel protected. Is that justified? I mean, after all, we live in a different world than the 14th century, right?
The Black Death was during a certain part of time when we all lived a little bit differently. So if we today we do see that infection. We do see the infection in the United States right now, mostly in I think nowadays in Africa probably, but We do see it, but the disease is different today than it was, like, you know the date's
Yes.
probably better than me, the
Yeah.
13th century, I think. And
14.
14, thank
Yeah.
you, thank you. And teach me a little bit about the history also. But as you know, at that time, people were living a lot differently today. Hygiene, people were not as clean, people were living differently, and those type of situations make a disease potentially much worse than in other settings. So today, when we have running water, we have toilets, we have laws for keeping animals vaccinated, and we don't have hopefully infected animals, rats around our house.
Yeah.
It makes the disease much less likely to be serious. So it's
Okay.
more that than the disease itself. We
Got
have
it.
lots of
Okay.
other diseases that are also really serious depending on the circumstances.
Okay. We also have modern science, which has already identified the Yersinia bacterium and given us plenty of options like vaccines and antibiotics to help people survive. Here is Dr. Q to help me explain it. What are some of the cures for the Black Death?
Well, we have antibiotics, okay? So we know about the bacteria. We know we've tested it against different antibiotics that we have today. And so we certainly have plenty of antibiotics that can be used to kill the bacteria that causes the disease. So fortunately, unlike other diseases, we have some now that are really hard to treat because we don't have a lot of antibiotics. You may have heard of some talking at home or reading the papers called MRSA or some other infections. But for this infection, we still have plenty of drugs, probably because we don't see it that often, so we don't have to treat it that often.
Good. Can some cures for the Black Death work on many versions of the plague or just one? Like the bubonic or the
The
pneumonic?
antibiotics, because the different types of plague you're talking about are all caused by the same bacteria. So the antibiotics will work against all those different types or presentations of the plague. So
We also have machines that can breathe for a patient and medicines that can raise their blood pressure if needed. If the plague is not treated fast enough, is there still a medicine or something else that could give the patient a chance of survival?
well, if they have the plague nowadays, most people who get the plague survive.
Yes.
So it's very different nowadays. So mostly nowadays, if you wait too long and someone comes to the hospital really, really sick, we'll give them the medicines. But we are lucky nowadays because we have a lot more technology to get them through the infection. In the old days, if they couldn't breathe while we were treating the infection, they might just simply die because they couldn't breathe. But now we can put them on a machine that'll breathe for them. So say the infection needed to take 10 days to get better. In the old days, we can give them the 10 days on the machine to allow the infection to get better, to artificially breathe for them, and we can artificially give them medicines that push up their blood pressure. So we have a lot of technology that can keep someone alive while we're waiting to get the infection better. And then once the infection's better, then we can take away all the machinery and stuff. So in the old days, we didn't have all of that. So that was even when we had medicines in the old days, you're right. The medicines, it might be too late. And
Yeah.
so
And also, most of the medicines in the old days, it was either they would cut you open and let you bleed the sickness out, or it would be herbs, and you would smell the herbs. And
oh,
the
you're talking about the
sickness
real
would
old
go
days.
away.
Yeah, I'm just talking about my old days, 20 years ago. But in those days, you're right. It was like they would put crazy stuff. They would put like leeches on you to suck
Yeah.
out your blood, or they would do hocus pocus. I don't think it helped that much.
Yeah, no.
Dr. Quintiliani thinks vaccines are really important. You know what? Let's just let him speak for himself.
Vaccination to prevent you from getting that. You know how that works?
Sort of.
Sort of the same way what I
Yeah.
mentioned here is that when they give you that vaccination, or all your vaccinations actually, it gives you a version of the bacterium, but it's not alive. It can't cause any harm. But the outside of it, the proteins all kind of look like the bacteria. So your body makes antibodies to fight it, and then you have those antibodies in your system. So when the real bacteria comes, your body already knows how to fight it. So it doesn't have it to take any time. It just prevents it from starting from the first place. So those shots, do you like shots?
Yeah, it's not a big
Man,
deal.
well, I hate them. I turn blue, I pass out. But I hate them, but I realize that they're important because of that. Vaccinations are super, super important. Much better, much more important than antibiotics or drugs. It's the most important.
How could you create a new cure for the plague?
Vaccine is the best. Well, we can make more drugs for sure. We probably don't need more drugs because we have plenty of drugs that work against the plague. If you were in a country that had a real problem with if we ever had an epidemic like in the past, then it would be nice to have a vaccine. That would be useful. But really right now, I mean, we have drugs that work quite well. So that in the rich countries like Europe and the United States, drugs can be distributed to people very rapidly. Like anthrax, a number of years ago, many people were given an antibiotic called ciprofloxacin to keep them from potentially getting anthrax. So we can do that in rich countries. In poor countries, it's not that easy. Vaccines are much more practical.
So, what if you find that there is a new strand of the plague where it does not respond to the antibiotics, vaccines, drugs that we have today? How would you create the new one? Would you modify the old antibiotics, or would you create an entirely new vaccine from the DNA of the new?
Well, we could do both things. In the right now, I use a lot of different antibiotics, drugs for infection, and the drug companies, what they've done is just simply taken an old one that doesn't work, they make a little change, and now it works again, and so they sell it because they make more money. And then that one doesn't work for a while, and then they make a little bit of change. And the problem is you can do that for a long time, for quite some time, but eventually it doesn't work anymore. And that's what's happening nowadays for regular infections. We're running
Like
out.
flu.
That trick worked for a long time, but that trick is no longer working anymore. We need new drugs that are completely different, that work completely differently. And so drug companies are working on that, but it's a lot harder than we thought because we've learned a lot about how bacteria multiply already. We know pathways and chemical pathways and how to block those pathways to kill the bacteria. We have drugs that the outside called the envelope of the bacteria, the cell wall. We have special drugs to kind of keep that from forming, to kill it. So we understand a lot of those ways to make a cell that can be blocked, to kill it. But unfortunately, we don't have that many more places to block anymore. We have drugs that have done it all. So yeah, we're kind of it's kind of a problem, yeah. Yes, in the end, therefore, what would still work would be a good vaccine. And again, as I mentioned to you before, I think vaccines are so important, and especially, can I say something from my point of view, my personal point of view, because some people don't really believe in them, and I feel exactly the opposite. It's one thing, because when I gave my daughter, told her she had to have her shots. Like anything in life, there can always be like one person in 10 million that can have a problem. But my daughter, she's going to have her vaccine, and she's going to take a chance, that 1 in 10 million chance that she could have a problem. Because by doing that, I also protect you and everybody else. So you get your vaccines, and you take a little teeny chance because you protect my daughter and everybody else. So that's what we do, because we live in a society together. We have some little responsibility for one another. So I think vaccines are really important for us living in a society.
All of this made me wonder about how a pandemic happens and why it spreads when it does and not at other times in history. Is it possible that the plague will cause a modern-day pandemic? Dr. Quintiliani was talking to me about the smaller outbreaks that have happened recently in Africa and the subject move on to viruses and his predictions for the future.
No, even in Africa, haven't seen the big outbreak like there. But you know what? Unfortunately, it may just be a matter of time. The conditions just have to be right, and we don't actually understand all of this, like in Ebola, which you've heard about. You know, why it's existed for certain diseases have existed for a long time. Then all of a sudden, it becomes a problem. So I don't think we understand always what causes that to happen. It just happens to be a confluence, a combination of many different factors that just simply happen at a certain time in history. which cause it to take off.
There's a lot of mystery surrounding it. Some people think that the plague was not caused by Yersinia at all. One of the most common theories is anthrax, but some have suggested that the plague was actually caused by a version of Ebola.
Now here's the scary part. We are running out of ways to create new and different cures. And with bioterrorism around now, the biological world isn't just you get sick and the doctors either cure you or you get better by yourself. Politics is now involved. And now we also have the threat of anthrax and possibly even MRSA looming over us. It's a pretty huge topic, the biological world and bioterrorism. Let's let Dr. Quintiliani explain.
Bioterrorism, have you ever heard about that? Where bad people, want to use certain things in the world to maybe hurt other people. And there's a list of things that they can do. One is anthrax. You might have heard about anthrax. Yeah. That's one. Actually, this particular bacteria is also listed on the list because if you, in the inhaled form, if you were to take it, it can kill you really quickly. And your body doesn't have time to fight it. Antibiotics, drugs don't have enough time to cure it. You just die, and that's why it can be used for those kind of really bad situations where someone will be like in a subway and spread it in the air, and it could kill a lot of people very quickly. So that's why it's considered a bioterrorist type of bacteria. Sorry.
Thanks, Dr. Quintiliani. Well, that's all for today. See you guys next time. Bye.